All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk to you about Washington's paid sick and safe time leave. So in the fall of 2016, Washington state voters approved Initiative 1433. That piece of legislation had four components. First, it increased the minimum wage over the next several years. Second, it ensures that tips and service charges are given to the appropriate employees. Third, it protects employees from retaliation if they're exercising their rights, for example, under minimum wage requirements or under Labor Standards Act. And finally, the piece that I'm going to talk to you about today, a statewide sick and safe time leave requirement. All right, starting this coming January 1st, January 1 of 2018, Washington state employers will be required to provide their employees with sick and safe time. So this is coming up soon, in just a little over 3 months. So this is a good time to apprise yourself of the requirements and to make sure that they're all in place before you have to implement them on January 1. As many of you know, the City of Seattle has a sick and safe time policy. So those of you that are employers in Seattle are already providing some of this, but the statewide policy that's coming into play is not identical to the Seattle policy. So later in my talk, I'm going to talk about some of the similarities and differences. But first, accrual. The statewide law will require you to accrue for employees 1 hour of paid leave for every 40 hours that they work. There is no limit to the amount that the employees can accrue. As far as usage goes, the leave will be paid to employees at their normal hourly rate. So this raises some questions. What happens if I have commission employees and their compensation might fluctuate? What if I've got exempt employees? Those questions haven't been answered yet. Labor and Industries is in the process of rulemaking, and those are some of the things that we expect to see them address before the end of the year. All right. Under the statewide policy, employees are able to use their leave starting on the 90th calendar day after they start their employment, and employers are required to carry over 40 hours worth of leave. It's important to note that all employees are eligible for this new benefit. This will apply to your full-time workers, your part-time workers, as well as temporary workers. So what can employees use this leave for? It's called sick leave and safe leave. So first of all, sick leave. If the employee themselves is sick, they're ill, they have an injury, they have a health condition, they need to seek medical diagnosis, they need to seek medical treatment, they're looking for preventative care. It also applies if their family members are seeking treatment. This would include domestic partners. So if they're helping someone in their family seek treatment, they can take their sick time. It also applies if their place of business has been closed by order of a public health official for health reasons. Hopefully that won't apply to any of you folks. All right, safe leave. To qualify for safe leave, it's got to be an absence that qualifies for leave under the state's Domestic Violence Leave Act. And some examples of that are, it's got to be reasons related to domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So for example, if they're seeking law enforcement assistance, if they're participating in a civil or a criminal trial or preparing for that, for an event resulting from domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, if they're seeking treatment by a healthcare provider, if they're obtaining any kind of services or helping a family member obtain services that arise from domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. If there's safety planning, for example, finding a safe environment for these folks, or a rape crisis center usage for themselves or a family member, those are all the kinds of things that this leave can be used for. All private and public employers are covered under the new law. There are notice, confidentiality, and verification requirements. The employer can require the employee to give reasonable notice of an absence so long as that's not interfering with their ability to use the leave. The employer can require medical verification, but only if the absence exceeds 3 days. They, as you might imagine, have to keep all the information confidential. All right, here are some additional requirements. Employees have to maintain health insurance for their folks who are while they're on leave. They can't require employees to find their own replacement when they're going to be taking the leave. They have to provide regular notice to the employees of their accrued leave. That's often done on a pay stub. That's part of their, it can become part of your system. If an employee is rehired within 12 months of separation from employment, they'll be entitled to reinstatement of the leave that they'd earned before they left employment. As you might imagine, there are discrimination and retaliation provisions. Employees cannot be fired, demoted, retaliated against, not only for using the leave, but for seeking to use the leave. They can't be threatened with a demotion or a termination. They can't be threatened with discipline. And the employers can't count leave that they take for disciplinary purposes. Accrued leave does not have to be paid out upon termination, and employers can front load the leave. And by that we mean you, if it is easier for your bookkeeping and processes, can dump the employee's leave into their account at the start of the year. They can then use it, and you've just got to be careful to periodically check back in to make sure that you've provided sufficient leave under the law. If you, for example, have an employee that maybe worked part-time, has worked more hours than you anticipated, you might not be providing enough leave. So front loading is great, but it does come with its own requirements. It's also fine for employers to be more generous than the law requires. For example, you can allow your employees to use the leave for reasons in addition to what the law requires. You could let them use it for jury duty, for example, and some folks like to do that. You can be more generous as far as the carryover goes. You can allow them to carry over more than the 40 that's required under the law. You can provide more generous accrual policies. You can allow them to accrue more than 1 hour for every 40. And of course you could pay out upon termination. You could have that as a policy that might help you retain or attract employees if you've got a generous policy in that regard. One important thing to note too is that employers may adopt a PTO or paid time off policy, and that will comply with the state law. So for a lot of folks, if you've been providing paid vacation and now you're thinking, on top of this, I'm now going to have to provide paid sick and safe time, you can kind of manage your finances by combining those policies and having a PTO policy. That's the case under the existing Seattle law as well, so some of you folks might already be doing that. All right, let's take a look at how Seattle compares to the state law. This handout will be available to you upon departure. I think you've got the slide in your materials, but it's real small, but we're going to have a sheet like this at the exit, so if you'd like to pick one of those up, you can do that. So just to go over this, as far as accrual, under the new law, it's 1 hour for every 40 hours worked. Under the existing Seattle law, it's 1 hour for every 40 hours for employees that have fewer than 250 full-time equivalent employees. For larger employers, it's 1 hour for every 30. As far as reinstatement goes, under the existing Seattle law, if the employee is reinstated within 7 months, they get their leave back. Under the new state law, it's 12. As far as use goes, under the existing Seattle law, after employment of 180 days, they can start using it. Again, an employer could provide a more generous option there. You could say it's shorter than that. But the minimum requirement under the Seattle law is 180. Under the new state law, it'll be 90. The Seattle law applies to private employers with more than 4 full-time equivalents and the city of Seattle. It doesn't apply to federal or state employees. The statewide law, all employers. Eligibility, very similar. Basically all employees are covered. Under the Seattle law, there's occasional employees are only covered after they've worked a certain number of hours. But under the statewide law, it's everybody. Effective date, the Seattle law has been in effect since 2012. Statewide law, as I said, goes into effect this coming January 1st. As far as carryover goes, the Seattle law has different requirements based on how big an employer is, and that's on the handout. Under the state law, it's 40 hours. Both allow front-loading, which I already talked about, and the PTO policy as well. And it's important to keep in mind that these two laws are real similar, but they have more restrictive requirements in different aspects. So if you're within Seattle, you're going to have to comply with the most restrictive of both of those. It's important to get these policies into place now. January 1 will be here before we know it. All right, I mentioned rulemaking. So Labor and Industries is busy coming up with rules and regulations. There are going to be notification procedures, record-keeping requirements, reporting requirements, processes to protect employees, provisions with regard to enforcement, and as I mentioned, they'll come up with some specifics with regard to how this law might apply if you've got exempt employees or if you've got employees on commission or other situations like that. I included a link up there. If anybody is interested in seeing where we are in the rulemaking process, they have had comment periods. You can go to that link that's in the materials and just kind of follow along. So I already mentioned that I'm going to have a handout out there for you. I'd like to let everybody know that we will be providing updates to the folks that get our emails. If you're not already on our email list, you can certainly sign up. The evaluation form has a spot for you to put your email. Of course, you can also email any of us that are here today from Ryan Swanson, and we'd be happy to add you to that and include you with our updates as this progresses.